Welcome, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started this morning. I wanted to introduce the moderator, Namita Gupta Wiggers, who is the co-founder of the Critical Craft Forum, as well as the director of Warren Wilson's Master of Arts in Critical and Historical Craft Studies. She'll be the moderator today, and she will introduce our panel. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to her.
Thank you. So thank you so much, Ben, for introducing our session. We really appreciated it. And for those of you who don't know Ben, Ben runs a podcast called Tales of a Red Clay Rambler. For the students who are in here who may not know about it, or the other folks who are not students, who are older and are just getting to learn about podcasts, you might check it out. Before we begin, we wanted to dedicate our session today to a colleague whose commitment to craft was unique and deep. Dr. Sandra Alfoti was a leading Canadian historian of craft. She was the co-founder of Nova Scotia College of Art and Design's Craft Institute, and Sandra worked through teaching, curating, writing, and mentoring. And her publications covered a range of topics, craft topics, from neo-craft, modernity and the crafts, to crafting identity, the development of professional fine craft in Canada, craft economies, First Nations craft, and much, much more. Sandra Alfoti was a professor, mentor, and colleague, lover of laughter, lover of life, and she left us with her incredible thinking and writing on craft, and she will be and is missed sorely. And we wanted to mention her partly because we have a Canadian on the panel, and partly because she passed away just recently, and while we were having our conversations about the panel. And it just seemed like a small way to honor somebody who had a very big impact on the field. And if you haven't read her writing or watched her videos, I highly recommend it. She talks about thinking through the hand in a really beautiful way. So what we're going to do today, before we begin, I would like to just share that I was really honored when the panelists invited me to moderate this discussion, because all three of these artists are going to share their work, their experiences, and their thinking today, and each of them engages ceramics in overlapping and divergent ways. While it may be easy and popular to categorize the projects that they do as social practice, our conversation today is not going to be about what social practice is, whether they are social practice or not. Instead, what we want to talk about is how ceramics affect engagement. And in this case, the kind of ceramics that each of them works with being tableware. So we're really trying to move the conversation to get ceramics specific and about that kind of engagement that each of them does. So each person is going to discuss their work, touching on why they work this way for about 5 minutes. After that, we're going to have a discussion together, and then we're going to open it up for you all to join us with questions, and there's a microphone right here. A gentle reminder, the time is very short for questions from the audience. So when you come up, please ask a question. It's not really, if you want to have a more extended conversation, we are going to have time outside for, and you can talk to the panelists about more specifics about projects. So when you come to the microphone, really try to engage what our presenters have shared, because we really want to sort of treat it as like a crit in the sense when you look at the object and you focus on it. Let's really try and engage the kinds of ideas that they have brought up and make your questions relevant to that. During the presentation, there are slides that are going to loop behind us. And each of these, I'd suggest that this is a great way for you to capture the websites and URLs and links to all the different projects. We're not going to speak to the slides specifically, but everybody's going to talk about their projects. So the first person who is going to speak, and I think I'll do them individually. How's that? Yeah? Okay. The first person is Stephanie Boyd, and Stephanie lives and works in Williamstown, Massachusetts. Her work is influenced by a sense of place, sensitivity to the questions about consumption of resources, and connection to local culture. Her recent work has been influenced by our current political situation, and she's going to discuss her project, Vessels for Change.
Thanks, Namita. It's hard to know where I start this story, but I keep coming back to the day that I became an American citizen in the first citizenship ceremony after Trump. That was in January 2017, and in August, after the horrendous clashes in Charlottesville, Virginia, with the white supremacist, I just decided that I'd had enough. I was dismayed and disgusted with the political environment we were living in and the social upheaval that that was contributing to. And so I just thought I have to do something. I grew up in Canada. I went to an all-girls Catholic high school, and I would never believe that 40 years later I'm still remembering phrases that the nuns would say, which were things like, do what you can with what you have with where you are now. So I found, I had 6 mugs on my shelf that had some words on it. Nevertheless, she persisted, a reference to Elizabeth Warren, and some female images. And I made a little Facebook video, which I felt was really putting myself out there because I don't like being in videos and pictures of myself on the web. Anyway, I offered these mugs up for sale for $100 with the promise that I would send the money to the Southern Poverty Law Center. And within a couple of hours, the checks were bought, delivered, the mugs were bought and delivered, and the check was in the mail. And I thought, okay, well, that was nice, but we really need to do more, and I think I can do more. So I rounded up 5 friends who made pots and said, hey, would you help me on a little project? And together we agreed to make 100 mugs, and we would ask artists in our area to decorate them. We thought we might be able to round up about 30 artists of all different media, painters, jewelers, printmakers. And anyway, by the end of the project, we had over 65 artists participating in the mug decoration. The mugs were sold in 8 days, I think, before we even had them made. We found a donor who gave us a matching grant of $10,000, and at the end of the project, we had raised $23,000 for the Berkshire Immigrant Center, representing about 10% of their annual budget. And the Berkshire Immigrant Center helps about 800 immigrant families every year in our area, so I guess in a way we supported 80 immigrant families. It was a tremendously rewarding project, and I can't wait to talk a little bit more about it after our other projects are introduced.
Thank you so much. And thank you for reminding me that you are of Canadian origin as well. I forgot that. So Carole Epp is going to speak next, and Carole Epp is also Canadian. She's a ceramic artist who lives and works in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. And she works on multiple platforms. Her ceramic blog, Musing About Mud, is 11 years old, which is shocking to think it's been over a decade. She also works through a project called Make and Do, through which she's building a database of Canadian clay and ceramic artists. And in partnership with National Clay Week, Carole developed The Crafted Dish, a ceramic cookbook. And these are the projects that she's going to touch on, or maybe more of one versus others, but
we'll see how the conversation goes, Lily. Thank you so much. I just wanted to start by just acknowledging how honored I am to be sitting up here with all of you. And I also want to, sorry, right under my nose, is that better? Sorry? Okay, wave at me up there if you can't hear me. So I was saying, it's just an honor to be here with these folks, but I also really want to acknowledge right from the get-go that these are not my projects. These are projects that I've been involved in, but I feel like there's probably a good couple dozen people who should be standing here beside me who have been really instrumental in these projects. So when I hear somebody say, Carole's project this, I really want to sort of distance myself from that because these things come together through the amazing communities that exist. And when I started musing, it's almost 12 years now. I mean, that was just my first way of getting out of grad school and just trying to find community. And anything that I do for this community is really, I see so much of it back, and I'm just like desperately trying to get deeper and deeper in with everybody that I'm working with. So I really want to acknowledge all of those people. I can't name you all, but there's, you know how people like, picture everybody in the audience naked. Picture me with like a couple dozen people standing here with me, and appreciate the work that they've done as well coming into this. So my sort of inclination with working on projects like this, I would say stems back to even when I was in my undergrad and just starting to make work in ceramics, and thinking about the material and thinking about how we use it in a domestic sphere, different than other art practices. I've worked on the gallery side of things, I've worked in admin, on boards, all those kinds of things, and so much of my interest is about getting out of those systems and finding different ways of engaging audience. And getting objects, art objects, crafted objects into different audiences' hands. So on some level, all of these projects have similar goals. And it's sort of, yeah, we'll get to that, I think, a bit more meaty-greedy. Cool. Go to you.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm juggling timers in between. All right. Thank you so much. So the third person in our conversation today is Nick Moen, and Nick is based in Asheville, North Carolina. Nick produces functional handmade porcelain to accent daily rituals, and he has two projects that he is going to touch on today. One is the Bright Angle, and the second one is the Democratic Cup project.
Hi, everybody. Can everyone hear me? No? Okay. Move up a little bit. So I'm not Canadian, but I like Canadians. I grew up in Minnesota, so it's close, I guess.
But have you read Sandra's work?
Yeah, some,
Yes, see? There you go.
So I founded the Bright Angle Studio, which is a collaborative ceramic design studio in Asheville, North Carolina. And our focus is on bridging the gap between craft and technology. So we set up systems of mold systems to reproduce products and for different projects where I'm able to train in other potters or colleagues to help make work. So we're able to scale up and do bigger projects. And one of the projects is the Democratic Cup, which I'm really excited about. It's kind of my passion project. And it was conceived by Yumi Horie in 2016, and she approached me to be one of the designers, and I told her that I was building a studio and I thought we could make 1,000+ mugs, and we did. I didn't know if it was quite true at the time, but the idea behind the project was to disseminate slow activism and create tools of empathy. So mugs are inherently a really amazing tool to connect with one another and to connect with the makers of the objects. And so we wanted to have a collaborative experience where we actually worked with 50 artists. So there was a couple dozen mug designers, and then there was a couple dozen artists that embellished the mugs or put narrative imagery on the outside. We've made more than 1,000 mugs in the past couple of years. One notable one, I think, is the Ruth Bader Ginsburg mug, and she's a really influential person in my life because she stands for a lot of things that I believe in. One is compromise. She is able to compromise, which I think is really important in this day and age with the polarized society that we have, but she also stands up for what she believes in. So she's fighting for that. So it was it was an honor to make a mug for her, and it was actually in the documentary, which is kind of wild. But with the mugs, we didn't necessarily have a kind of a way to activate them, right? So this year, Sarah Milfeld and Ursula Hargens put together a project called Land of 10,000 Stories, which is at the Northern Clay Center. And we built a toolkit to create conversations between neighbors. So you could actually activate the mugs and conversations would happen where people would share their backgrounds and their values and try and feel more neighborly, even though people really came from different places. And these gatherings take patience and respect and listening. And one example that I'll just end on is, because they're doing these experiences at the Clay Center right now, and my friend Max Star-McCusker, who's one of my heroes, identifies as a different gender than they were born. And Mac did the conversation at the Clay Center, and they got paired with a Lutheran priest. And so I ran into Mac yesterday, and Mac was really kind of frustrated because Mac's constantly educating and Mac's open to sharing their experience going through feeling, different or kind of identifying with something other than what they're expected in society. So I've learned a lot from Mac, which is a really amazing thing. But kind of the themes that we talked about to live by are empathy, trust, and love. And if you're able to empathize with somebody, you can relate to them and feel where they're coming from, and then you can trust them, and ultimately you can love them. And that's kind of, what I think America needs more of, is to be able to connect and listen to one another. So that's the kind of the basis of the project. I'm sure Ayumi has a whole different perspective on it, but it's a big project to kind of encapsulate. So. Yeah, and I'm super happy to be here. Yeah, it's a really
Awesome.
great team.
Should we mention, I'm not gonna, I'm saying should we, and I'm about to mention, Ayumi was going to be on the panel with us today, but she had a baby, so, the baby took precedence, definitely took precedence. But thank you all. That, I think, is a great beginning for us to have this conversation. And so given that the description of the session is thinking outside the pot, I think it's a nice play on a number of different words. Thinking outside the pot means, thinking about what happens around it, but it's also about the kind of ways you are taking pots into other situations and activating them in different ways. So there's a nice play on the interactivity and the action and where the pot is living and dwelling and doing its work. And with this focus on ceramics affecting social and political engagements across divides, I think what I decided is to structure my questions in sort of a more simple way of, I think you heard in their descriptions, everybody's descriptions, they touched on a bit of why they're doing the projects that they're doing. And so now we're going to move into a little bit of discussion about the who and the what and the how, and then talk a little bit about some of the social dimensions of this kind of work. So I think that I'd like to start with the question of who. And given the variety of kinds of projects that you work on, who is your work for, who is your work about, and who is your work engaging?
That's a big question.
I know.
Do we just jump in?
Jump in, jump in.
I found when I was doing my project, I thought the project was, for the Berkshire Immigrant Center that we were helping. But I think in the end, a lot of it was for the individuals who were involved. As we contacted people to participate in this project, to a person, they said, yes, I would love to, because so many of us were starved with how do we engage with the community in a bigger way. And I think the participants of a project often gain more sometimes than what the recipient is. Since our project was about fundraising, it's a little bit different, although it did enable us to interact with the mug in, I thought, a very interesting way, as we invited painters into our studio to watch them select the mug as a canvas that they were going to start to do their expression on was quite fascinating. We really broadened the understanding among different artists in our local community. One day we had a very good oil painter there, and he's got this dry bisqueware mug with the underglaze, and it's sticking to the mug, and he's like, this is not oil paint. So, and the other thing that really happened that I think that was about people was having 5-10 people sit around a table working with their hands on a project together and talking sometimes around the political environment that we were in and sometimes directly. And it was really a community building project for those that were involved.
I think it's interesting what you're saying in that there is a tendency to think about these kinds of projects as being something that is just about where it is outside. You're talking about the making moment, the inception and the production on this side before it goes out into the public sphere, and that communal conversation happening there. I think it's important to consider that there's different moments where in the process of making that these kinds of things happen.
Yeah, I mean, when you consider that I live in a town of 7,000 people and over 70 people were involved with this project, it was quite integrated into the local community. And I think it was both good and bad that those that were involved had such a sense of gratification. I think we may have missed getting that sense of gratification from the people that we were trying to support, but next time we'll work on that.
I mean, that resonates with me too, because I think we all got into clay because it's a really malleable material, right? It responds to us, but then I'm sure everyone's had the experience of sitting at a table or a wheel next to all your friends and, chatting and hanging out, and you almost forget that clay is at the center of all that. And that's the making process, but it ends up making us all engaged problem solvers, I think. And by being problem solvers, it allows us to address these situations of what happens to the objects after they're made. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that the act of making is a really important part of it as far as like building the community. And I'm really curious how, because we're all coming together for 4 days here, but how does that disseminate, or how does the experience that we have with clay and with each other of making, how can that relate to other facets of the people in America or Canada? Sorry.
We're part of America, too.
Right.
You apologize, that means you're almost there.
I'm conscious.
I think it's sort of, well, to talk about the crafted dish really quick too, this is sort of a different project in the sense that we didn't have this group of people who were together in a physical space. The crafted dish is a cookbook that includes artists from across Canada who are sharing insight into their studio, family recipes, and all the proceeds went to a charity that's in Toronto, and so there's that awareness of what each artist was contributing to and what the end goal was. But it wasn't like we had this object in the same sense of things, and so I think how answering that question is a bit harder for me, because each of us, I think everybody involved, whether it was the designer of the cookbook or myself or everybody in National Clay Week and all of the artists and the jurors, there was sort of that level where we had something in our own space, and we were, and I like that idea too, that even in our own private spaces, we're being asked to think about these things in those making process, even if that object isn't there and we're not necessarily face to face talking about those things. I think it's important when we're making physically in the studio by ourselves to be conscious of those things. So part of that I hope sort of came through, but we don't have that sort of physical object. And even with the charity that, and I won't speak too much of them, but you can look it up, The Stop in Toronto, which is an amazing group, and they're part soup kitchen, they're part food bank, but they also have these amazing garden spaces in Toronto for newcomers coming into Canada, where they can actually grow seeds and food from their own countries. And so their focus is very much about creating community and having all these connections globally. And so to me, it made sense to have these connections across Canada. But then I also feel like, when you're like, everybody was in the same room painting, I'm like, that would have been great. And it's like, I could have done that in Saskatoon with a smaller group of people, but there's something about trying to engage. Exactly. And I mean, I guess that's me too. It's like with Make and Do, we're always trying to engage the larger community too, so that there's more awareness of where everybody's at, so we can foster more smaller projects here and there.
Well, you're so good at that too. I mean, creating community in the digital world is so important right now. Yeah, and so I think that by creating a safe and inclusive space, also putting the Canadians out there, because it's hard to figure out what's going on up there.
You're probably surrounded by them.
You are, literally.
So this is interesting, thinking about connectivity through the internet. And the internet is a big part of all of the three projects you're mentioning. And there's a certain level of anonymity involved, a certain level of not really knowing who you're connecting with also. So I wonder if you might speak a little bit to, I think we've done a nice job of introducing the making and the lack of making in the same room, but the construction side. So thinking about it from the reception side, who are you trying to reach, and who has access to your projects?
Who would like to go?
Go for it.
I can jump in. Yeah. I think all of these projects for me, what I'm trying to do is get outside of the art gallery systems into those other, the goal is that, like by addressing food and cooking, it broadens the scope of who might be attracted to that. Part of the reason that the Stop as a charity was really interesting to us was because how they took something as simple as the idea of the food bank and they changed that into something that, they host these really Instagram-ready parties and stuff like that, and they bring in all these different types of community to talk to them about food security, and so they're sort of trying to change the shape of how people even view those organizations within our society. So we were sort of really interested in working with them with that. I sort of had this train of thought, though, when you were talking about this whole like using technology and social practice or with political work. And I think it's really, I keep thinking back to this idea that we can reach all these other audiences in one way, and it's really great, but then it's also, yeah, like we're sheltered behind something. And I'm really interested in how, when we take on these kinds of projects that are trying to help communities, I kind of almost see a disconnect when we do it online too, which I'm trying to challenge too, because it's like I posted something on Facebook the other day and it was talking about how if I turn off my Facebook and my Instagram, am I still an activist? Right? And so it's like, it's very easy to sort of put all those things up there, but how do we make ourselves really uncomfortable and really get into those things? And I think those are challenges with the projects that I've been involved in too, is that we're still not getting there. And so I totally went off topic, but those are some of the things that are constantly in my head when I'm thinking about, because it's very important that this benefited the artists that are in it. It benefits Canadian ceramics getting more exposure. But at the end of the day, it was actually about putting financial money into the hands of an organization who are actually going to help people and oftentimes help artists, because artists are living at that low income level as well. But so for me, these projects are always sort of a way to sort of challenge different methodologies of making art or being involved with social practice, to say, does this actually work? Does it actually reach that audience or those people in need that we're trying to address? Or are we just sort of doing these projects and going, good job, we did something, we showed up, and then we're popping back out and we're done, right? And I think it's easier with technology to just sort of do those things where you step in and step out, step in and step out.
Well, I mean, for me, one of the reasons that I'm here is that I recognize how small our project was, even though we went from $600 to $23,000, I think, when we ran it on a larger scale. It's still really nothing, and we think about how to affect real change in this country. We have to look at where is the power, who has the access, who has the money. And so to fundamentally change our society, we have to either have an enormous grassroots change across the countries, both countries, all countries. And so, you know, getting outside of my comfort zone and coming here and try to work with other people to inspire other people to do things, that having lots of little small projects may add up to something big. One thing I was really fascinated on this little project, we had a donor who offered to give us $10,000. We approached other wealthy people in my neighborhood, of which there are many. Many of them are Republicans, nothing against Republicans, but they're not really supportive, or these people, of immigrants. So we had a really hard time fundraising outside of the normal structures. And even the bank that would normally give, you know, $500, $5,000 to projects for, you know, schools or education or arts, would refuse to give us money because we were a political organization. I'm like, hey, we're making pots with some artists, you know? And so I think it's really interesting on how can we really affect that power dynamic in our countries. And it's, I'm seeing some very hopeful things in the US, not only in the arts community, but lots of grassroots efforts where people are standing up and taking initiative and doing something. I'll stop there.
Going off that and Carole's experience online, one challenge we had with the Democratic Cup was that we were kind of marketing it in an echo chamber. And so I think that that's a really important thing to acknowledge, is that you know, even doing social activism online or sharing the projects we're doing, it's going to an audience that's very specific, and it's really tough to reach the audience that probably needs to be engaged in order to create connections that are going to, you know, advance the discussions or help people understand each other. And so that's a terrifying part of it all, is that we're kind of talking mostly to a small group, or only able to reach a smaller group, because a lot of people don't want to deal with what the other people have to say. And so, yeah, we got tuned out a lot with the Democratic Cup, and having Democratic in it, too. Even though that means everyone has a voice, you know, but, yeah, it definitely turned a lot of people off. And so, I mean, typically when you know you're reaching the other audience that doesn't understand, you get trolled, you know, and so people will write really mean, hateful things, and we didn't get enough of that. So, I mean, it would have been great to be able to respond to that, but
That's how you see the success is based on.
We're infiltrating.
right, yeah. Well,
angry
the
is it?
Facebook algorithm is, spreading out, but I think that everyone kind of wants to see the same thing because it's comfortable.
I think this echo chamber question is a really, really important one. And then also some of the things that you touched on, each of you, on the things that were successful, or I think it's easy for us to talk about what worked in the project.
Right.
Let's shift thinking about this echo chamber as one of the sort of the problems that needs to be addressed. What are some of the other things in your projects? When you think about how things worked, how did things not work? What were some of the glitches you had, or the challenges that you had that came along with these projects? And I'm thinking about some of the things you were talking about yesterday, Carole.
Yeah, well, I think I had something and then you finished talking and it's gone, right? I think what I really learned by working on this project with everybody is that, when you're talking about the small things versus the big things, right? And I really see that, I'm a firm believer that all of our actions are political, no matter what we're buying, what we're eating, all of that kind of stuff. And so I feel like those big actions are necessary, but it should never dismiss the small actions of sitting with somebody when they have a hard meeting with an MLA or the government to, get assistance or all those sorts of things, same as petitioning and marching in the streets kind of thing. But what I really learned with this project is that, and I guess this is my criticism, is that we all really want to do something and we don't really know how to do it, and then we all sort of just go, okay, I'm going to do this. And I really want a project like this to actually, I wish somebody had done that and then I could have done the next step. So I kind of want this, and I've talked to a couple of different people about doing this a woman and her husband came and they got a whole bunch of them, and he's a cook, and so they're going to integrate some of these recipes into their restaurant and raise awareness with it through that. We had applied for a grant in Canada, which we didn't get, to do a large dinner table, and where we were actually going to make meals out of this and stuff. So I'm really curious about finding other people's projects now, and just building on their successes, because I feel like otherwise we're all just sort of marching ahead at the same time rather than concentrated on this. We're all wanting the same successes, but then we're also all doing them in different ways. So somebody emailed me the other day, are you going to do another one? I'm like, no, but we need to do other things based off this, and I want these sorts of things to just be the starter for something else beyond that. And when I think about Make and Do and the clay directory, which is, right now it's just the artist side that we've got up, but the idea is to have all of the organizations across Canada as well on there. And part of the goal of the directory is to have no barriers whatsoever, aside from being Canadian, sorry to the Americans, but beyond that, at all levels of learning and experience, we want everybody to be on that directory. And part of that, to me, it's not just so much about celebrating what's happening in Canada, getting to know our neighbors, but it's also just building a base platform wherein when we do projects like this, when we did this project, I feel like I failed because I couldn't access all the people that I should have been able to access. I couldn't be as inclusive as I needed to be because I couldn't find them. And so building the directory for me is about creating that baseline where now we know more where those people are and we can access them a lot better so that those projects can be much bigger. Does that make sense?
Yeah, this speaks to something you were saying yesterday that made me think about your projects as being more a constellation of projects where things are building on each other, but they're dealing with different aspects of connecting community and ceramics and asking these questions through their work.
Yeah.
Well, I think to piggyback on that, one thing you were talking about is accessibility, because we want all of our projects to be able to reach as many people as possible. And I think that the layout of the crafted dish is exposing pots, but then also there's cooking involved. So everyone cooks, I think, for the most part, but you're able to reach or kind of turn people onto pots through food or through cooking. But you were saying it's self-published, right? So there's this financial limitation that I think we all struggle with as potters too, because what we make is fairly devalued because there's no mug shortage. So with the Democratic Cup, they're $68. And it costs a lot to make. We have silver luster decals. They're made out of porcelain. A lot of hands touch them. And that kind of pushes them out of an accessible range, arguably, because people think that that's too much, even though I think, it's totally worth it. And I think most of us understand as pottery collectors, but it's still an issue as far as reaching a wider audience. So I like that about the book, bringing in food or another aspect of life that people can realize that handmade pots are a thing that, can be used as a tool to, create, scenarios where you're eating together.
Yeah, well, and I think all the artists that submitted stuff for the book too, I mean, there's little write-ups about the recipes and stuff and where they come from, so we were able to sort of touch on all of the different cultures that exist within Canada too. And I think there's a lot of beauty in that, right, that goes just to us as a culture within Canada and how we can showcase that, not just within our art, because we all bring that out in our art, but also within our cooking, within our
So it
families.
sounds like, I'm sure we all had some logistical and organizational struggles as we were going through our programs, but I think we're all struggling with the main issue is how do we do more? How do we make it bigger? How do we make it have deeper change? And I really don't have the answer to that. Our project was, volunteer effort, so certainly we can't, do more. I think we have to look at not just one strategy for moving forward, but many different strategies, and finding people who are inspiring to us or want to work with us and ideas, and just keep pushing forward. And I think we also should not, though, undervalue the small things that happen. So after several hours and hard work and organization and frustration on this project that we did for 2 years, when the director of the Berkshire Immigrant Center said in a year that immigrants, allies, and advocates have been pretty dark and frustrated, this boost from the community feels pretty amazing. So her biggest thank you was about somebody cared and saw us, even if we didn't make, a huge fundamental change. And I think that sense of hope that you can give people just by doing a small project is invaluable, priceless. Isn't that the Visa commercial?
So let's keep talking about the social dimensions that we're on right now about the project. And here I'm borrowing just a little bit from Claire Bishop's work on participation. And if those of you who may not know Claire Bishop has a book. She's written a lot about museums and social practice and social engagement and so forth, but the Whitechapel series has a great compilation of essays called Participation, and so that's the one that I'm thinking about right now. She addresses work that moves away from individual engagement to social forms of being together. And what really interests me about all of your projects, and I know that your project, Carole, isn't about making in the way of, making this object, but it's about objects that have been made. So it is about tableware and so forth, and that dish, right? The dish, the cup, the mug. These are iconic craft forms, iconic ceramic forms, overlooked forms in many, many ways, even though that's probably what most of us have collected over the years. So I'm really interested in this shift between the individual to the collective to the individual again that happens to your objects through your projects. You make the cup goes out into the internet, into the interwebs, and then it comes back and there's this intimacy of someone holding it, someone putting their mouth on it, talking with one another. Let's talk a little more. Let's push a little harder on that. What happens to those craft objects, to ceramic objects in these kinds of social engagements that's different from other kinds of socially engaged projects? And I'm being specific. I know I said no, so that I wasn't talking about social practice, because I can hear some of you going, Namita. But I think there's a big difference between social practice and social engagement. And I think what you do is social engagement. And so I'm trying to tease those apart. But yeah, so let's talk about those social dimensions of the object itself. What's happening there?
Well, I think the most exciting moment of pots is when they're activated, so when they're used, right? When your lips touch a mug or your fork goes on a plate, and that's what they're meant for. And so I think seeing that as kind of a jumping off point or a platform for an interaction with this thing. I don't know a lot of other objects that really are able to create gatherings of people, with food or drinks, and I think that having the meaning in those things and the connection with the person that made it is a really kind of special thing that sets pots apart from a lot of other objects.
Yeah. I think, go ahead.
The pots in our project turned out to be way more interesting than I had expected. Not the actual pot themselves, but their whole life. We charged $100 for these mugs, sight unseen. You didn't get to pick your pot. They were made by 5 different people and decorated by 60 to 70 other people. And we were a little stressed on how people were going to feel about receiving this mug that they may or may not like. Although on the other hand, at the end of the day, you had a maker and a painter and an owner of that mug, and all I could keep visualizing was those 3 sets of hands that were so intimately involved with this object. And also that, some of the mugs were definitely more successful than others. Some were thin, fat, ugly, pretty, colorful, not just as the people who we are helping are, and the people who purchased them, and the people who made them. And I just felt that it symbolized us adopting the immigrants into our society, where you don't really necessarily get to pick the person, but you end up loving them anyway once you get to know them. So it was a really special moment when people picked up the mug that they had, and many people afterwards wanted to meet both the artist and the potter that had made it, so it really drew people together in a special way. So, what turned out to be just a logistic headache turned into a really special moment for the participants.
I think for me, when I think about functional work, and I've got my practice in my own studio, I've got a line of sculptural work that's political, and functional work as well, but I see functional work as, in a lot of ways, actually a more powerful way of approaching a lot of this commentary or these discussions that we want people to have. I've noticed over the years when I do workshops or what have you, people come to objects of beauty or something that's familiar or nostalgic to them that they have in their everyday lives with a lot more openness and willingness to have larger discussions, whereas a lot of art forms that are equally as political or dealing with the same subject matter can be a lot more confrontational. So to me, there's so much power in that common object that we know exactly how it feels in our hand before we pick it up or whatever, and we sort of subvert those objects to have these really large discourses about politics and about environmental concerns, whatever, what have you, but we allow the audience to do it in such a comfortable way. It's very inviting to have dinner with people, but we're going to sit here and actually we're going to get really nitty-gritty about some really ugly stuff, right? But if I show you something big on a screen that's really confrontational, and it's confrontational in the same way as media portrays what's happening in the world, we're predisposed to turn that off. We change the channel. Right? So coming in with a cup and then really talking about how somebody had to drop the F, how effed up politics are. But
Say the whole thing, Carole.
But doing that through a cup, it allows this comfort zone. It says we're already in this intimate space as well. I'm already sitting with you, so we're already comfortable with each other. So let's get deeper in on that. I think that's why.
Even if not comfortable with each other, at least willing to have some kind of interaction.
Yeah, and
whether it's
face-to-face
comfortable or
interaction.
not. Yeah. So I want to take the last 15 minutes to open it up for questions, and I know that it's really hard to come down here, but we are recording the session, so I'd love to invite you to come down and ask some questions. Is there anybody who has a question? Just raise your hand so I know you're heading down. Impossible to come down?
Just yell at us, Janet.
I'm leery. I'm going to be honest with you.
Here, why don't I do
leery
it?
of passing mics because people hold it like it's a conch. Why don't you? Do you want to? Can you say your question and I'll repeat it?
Well, I'll ask a question of the audience while we're waiting.
I think she's got it.
She's got it?
Yeah, she's
Okay.
Your projects. And perhaps one of the things that has to happen for a project to have legs is that you have to give up ownership of it so that it starts to acquire a momentum of its own. So maybe with Carole's dinnerware and cookbook project. What you have to do is in some way help initiate a network of local centres that meet regularly to have dinner using handmade pottery.
Yep.
So you continue to benefit our community, but in that they can also act locally.
Yeah.
Because if you get a lot of small communities acting locally, then you start to have a global action. And so I think a lot of the time we do things that are good things. We do fundraising, and there's no question about it. Fundraising is one of the most important things we can do. But we also have to give ownership of the project to the people we're helping.
Yeah.
And I speak from the point of view of working quite a lot with Indigenous artists in Australia. And there are a lot of people who do work with Indigenous artists in Australia, and they feel good about doing it, and they want to keep doing it because they feel good about it. But you have to somehow hand it over to them to run the projects, the art centres, you know, do all the business themselves. And I think that's the nexus. The advice I was given when I first started doing the work that I do was, you have to make yourself absolutely expendable.
So this is a really great question, this question of where do you... Oh, sorry. So this is a really great question about this issue of ownership, authorship, but then also this question of dissemination that goes out, right? And I think you've also raised another really important point about the critique of so many of these kinds of projects is it's about feeling good, and someone's feeling good about it, and where do you go from just that sensation of feeling good to actually affecting something? So, yeah.
So I wouldn't say just feeling good as if it's like not a good thing. Like that feeling good motivates us to carry on and do more things. You know, one of the motivations for me on this project was and I'm sure many of you are asked, can you donate a mug or a bowl or whatever to some fundraiser? And I found it was the most unsatisfying thing to do. They come to the door, you give it to them, and like that's the end of it. So part of it, that feeling good motivated me to do a project that I thought would be fun for not only me to be involved with, but for other people, which I think then contributes to the success. So we have to take that little feeling good element as a positive that we bring to projects and get us out the door in the day. I don't know about these others, but I don't believe that we all necessarily feel ownership over our projects. I think we're here trying to share them and motivate others and maybe get some ideas from you on how to make them bigger and better.
No, I love this point, Janet, and thank you for it, because I feel like that's one of the things I keep coming back to is just being that one little element and then handing things off, and I think for me that's why, and like you talk about this constellation approach, I'm one of those people that's like, I'm gonna hit it from all sides and try and figure out the answer to this. All these different projects that I do, they're all just sort of attempts at different methodologies of finding solutions, and so I end up with like a couple answers over here, a couple answers over there. But for me, it really is about trying to find the ways then to, yeah, it's not about me. It's about handing that off. But that's also a hard thing to do because you're asking of other people, you're putting weight. But so for me, how I've been trying to reconcile that and trying to hand these projects off to a larger community is by stepping back and focusing on the Canadian Clay directory, because that's what I found is that I couldn't find always those communities and those people. So by building the directory and trying to promote that, and again, this is a huge amount of work that May can do and our whole group is taking on, and we have to get people to actually come to the directory and use the directory and upload all of their stuff. But it's that long-term goal, though, then that when we have that one person in that community that goes, I want to take this book and I want to do something with it, they can easily, quickly see in their province, in their area, who are those people? Who are all the organizations that could sponsor it that are clay related? Who are all the other artists I can access? So that whole project for Make and Do, I think, is that step back to go, okay, this can only get so far on its own. How do we build that foundation that will help other people to do that? But beyond that, like, I don't know the answers yet, and I don't know if the directory will do that the way that we're intending it to. But again, it's like a different methodology that we're testing out, and we want that feedback to whether or not that's working, or are people just uploading their photos because they think it's fun, right? Yeah, can those things actually change it?
Well, and I think we're all facilitators, and so it kind of takes facilitation to set up these templates or platforms in order for the stuff to spread or disseminate. And with the Democratic Cup, we got really fortunate because Ursula and Sarah from Northern Clay Center set up these town hall meetings. So around the state, we made 4 new mugs, and all of a sudden there was a room full of strangers that were having conversations. And there's actually audio tapes on the Democratic Cup website now, and then you can hear more at the Northern Clay Center. But a lot of the conversations are really difficult, and there was a lot of dead ends because it's hard to figure out what question everyone can relate to, and both of y'all brought up immigration, and I think that that's a really important thing because we're all immigrants, and Ayumi really pushes that, and Ayumi thinks that's one thing where we can kind of share each other's values, because that's something, all right, we all accept that, but what does it mean? Where do you come from? What's the dish that's native to you, or what did you grow up with? And there's no dissent there, there's no arguing, you're just listening and sharing that story of, where you came from. So I think that that's kind of a pretty powerful question as far as being able to start these conversations that we've been focusing on.
Thank you. Thanks, Janet, for the question. There's one up here.
Yeah, I apologize if this was covered earlier because I missed the beginning of the talk, but you did mention that you really feel like there's a difference between social practice and social engagement, and I was wondering if you could sort of summarize what you see those differences as.
So at the beginning, I said I didn't want to talk about social practice. Essentially, I think that social practice has become a term for a particular way of working. It's become something in the academy that defines a kind of practice, a kind of way. Now we talk about people working and making in these terms of practices, and I think that it fits a certain kind of model. But what that entails, it varies dramatically from program to program and person to person. But I think social engagement is a different thing because it's about the interaction. It's about that cup, and the exchange that can happen with that object in a different sort of way. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive, but I don't think they're exactly the same. And I think socially engaged work doesn't have the implication of broad-scale activist change, social change, in the same way social practice seems to be looked at critically as that it's going to do something more than just what it is. It's going to somehow take on more than perhaps a lot of those projects can. Does that clarify a little bit? It's muddy. But I'm playing around with trying to tease them out because I think social practice gets used as, oh, that's social practice, that's this, and I just don't think it's the right. It's like when people put things in boxes, I always want to kind of push on the edges.
Hi, I'm running low on time, so I'm just going to drop a food for thought thing. And that every time I hear someone mention community, I want to understand what they mean when they say community. So if everybody could maybe just speak on exactly what you mean when you say community, what community you're engaging, whether or not it's a community that you're already involved in, or if you're going out into other communities and looking to engage outside of your comfort zone.
Can I just say I love my students?
You're responsible for that question?
No, they are. But I love them for asking it.
I realize that we use that word community frequently, and just this morning I was thinking, is anybody going to know what we mean when we say community? It's one of those words I think it makes sense in the context. It could be the community of artists, or the community of people involved with the project, or the community of all the people in your country, or 2 countries. So I don't think there's one little answer to that.
Well, to me, I think community is having a shared purpose, right? So there has to be something in common in order for a community to exist, and having a shared purpose, allows that to happen. And so each of our projects, there's been, some theme that everyone can relate to, but at the same time, that's the one thing that connects them. And so, I mean, that's a great question. How do you bring up the other things that everyone brings to the table in that community if there's just one theme? I don't know. What do you think, Carole?
I don't know. I like the part of the question about, like, how are you going beyond your communities and stuff like that? And I think that that's something for me personally in my own practice, to not talk about all this, but my own practice, that I constantly question in the work that I'm doing is am I just making the work, does the objects matter, or am I actually having an impact somewhere else? And is there other ways of doing that? Is there ways of even stepping back from art and having those impacts? I look at community, and I don't like the word. We use it. I don't like it because, to me, it makes everybody a conglomerate. It's really about the individuals. And when we were talking earlier about the idea of, like, helping on a large scale versus helping individually, to me, it still goes back to that individual. I think there's still so much power that we dismiss about, like, working directly with that one person and helping their life be changed. Because if we all did that with one person, then so many would be impacted. And I hate to say it at a SRAMS conference, but I'm also of the mind too that when I make these objects, when I make a cup and I put it out there, that it's a catalyst for the conversation, it's a catalyst for the interaction with that other person. And if the object at the end disappears, and it's just that conversation and that change that we can have echoing back to each other in conversation, that's what it's about for me. So it's actually not about the mug, it's not about any of that. Can I end on that?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So